Hello, welcome to our podcast, International Aid in the Post-USAID Era. Thank you for joining us on the various platforms. Today, we're going to discuss the current and future impact of dismantling of USAID on the international aid and development landscape. We are a group of graduate students in the International Education Policy Program at the University of Maryland, College Park. My name is Chris Smithson, and I'm joined today by my wonderful peers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Horvath.
Hi everyone, I'm Shamaim Kermani.
Hi, I'm Floria Buawanti.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Grigoreva.
Hi, and I am Anastasia Lavrenyuk.
All right, welcome to everyone who's listening, and welcome to my colleagues and co-hosts as we have this very important discussion around aid and development. So we all remember the heart-wrenching images of USAID workers being unceremoniously evicted from their place of work in February 2025. And this was only a few weeks after President Trump took office. This marked the end of an important era of international aid and development. It also meant the end of careers, lifestyles, livelihoods, and really, really important work. The emotions are very high, they were very real and raw, and we all felt the collective pain of the moment. But emotions aside, I think the world knew that the field will never be the same after those moments. So today we're going to be talking about a few things, including the implications of policy shifts for global education and development. We're also going to be looking at the associated disruptions because of the dismantling and its impact on education projects. We'll be looking at some critical scholarly perspectives, some of which we've spent the last several months examining. And then finally, we're going to consider what the future is going to look like. And we're taking into consideration some of the important points that were made by other co-hosts whom we interviewed over the last several weeks. These co-hosts, you'll hear from them in their own words, have had several years of experience within the field. And I'll briefly introduce them here, but you'll hear them during the course of this podcast. So first of all, George Kisa joined us. He's a former USAID Foreign Service national in Kenya. Next, we had Anna Roberts, who's again a former USAID representative on the Hill. She's currently with the Basic Education Coalition and also with UMD, a very important organization that has formed in the wake of the dismantling of USAID. We have Josh Josa, former USAID Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And then finally, Representative Johnny Oshelski, or Johnny O, from Maryland's 2nd Congressional District, who has openly condemned the dismantling of USAID. So for our listeners who are not aware of the history of USAID, USAID was founded in 1961. That makes it today 65 years old. International aid and development started long before USAID, but when this institution was founded, it forever changed the landscape of international aid. And this is what makes it such a global force. And the dismantling that took place early in 2025 is still being felt. The aftershocks are still being felt a year later. So when we were interviewing or talking with, I should say, because these are really great conversations, by the way, when we were talking with the former staffers about the implications of policy shifts now that USAID has ended, we found some really important bits of information, some gems really, and they also added to some of this conversation what those disruptions looked like. And we could say that there were disruptions, but to hear it from the practitioners, those on the ground, what exactly it looked like right then was important. So, Mackenzie, I know that this is something that has been on your mind. So, how might dismantling foreign aid agencies like USAID affect the U.S. credibility and influence abroad, as well as how might it influence policy shift, right? So, international policy, national policy, even, right? So, what does that look like, Mackenzie?
Great. Thank you, Chris. So a big part of this podcast is really to create a discussion around the dismantlement of USAID and kind of the recent ruptures in US credibility within the foreign development industry. We were able to talk with our practitioners regarding their experiences regarding the more or less abrupt rupture of the agency and its impact within their various projects and programs. Josh ended up talking about the work that he was doing around disability advocacy and education throughout various countries, and in particular, the work within Rwanda and their projects, including bilingual deaf education programs for local students.
And what could happen from all of those. UDL, we worked with the different stakeholders within country, including disabled people organizations, and having their input and taking all of that into the design process. And then USAID was dismantled. And really, it's unfortunate to see all of those programs close and one specific project back to Rwanda. The team that was working in Rwanda said that once USAID closed and there was no contact, USAID Rwanda did attempt to reach out and say, hey, we don't have any information, we don't have anything, but USAID headquarters just cut contact. No pay for their staff. Even to this day, their staff have not been paid, and that happened in several different countries and contracts that were going.
And Mackenzie, I think we can agree that all of our co-hosts agreed that the transition, the cancellation of the projects was so abrupt, and that if only there was a little bit more time to kind of finish the projects or move some of this work to other organizations, how much better that would have been, right? And so, for example, we can see that George here is saying,
perhaps the bigger issue is it was a bit abrupt. Had there been perhaps a longer transition, maybe it would have been a lot better. I think the abruptness was a bit disruptive. And so there were different levels of success. There are areas where maybe governments try to step in and pick up the work, but it's a mixed bag. That's all I can say. It's a mixed bag.
Yes, I agree. With George's comment, he's discussing that some countries were able to kind of pick up the work that was left over from the agency leaving. But however, it's a mixed bag, like he said. Not every country has the capacity or resources to be able to fill in these gaps. And so not only the disruption of this dismantlement, but the timeline, like you said, Anastasia, how abrupt it was, how of a surprise and making a context or a situation where a lot of these projects, a lot of the community members involved in this work had to pick up the pieces, and there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Another interesting point that our co-host brought up was that some of the programs in education did continue, and so here Anna is talking about Jordan.
So for the USAID programs, when everything happened, all of the basic education programs were closed except for the programs in Jordan. Those programs continued because of advocacy from the government of Jordan. It's a very politically important country for the US government. And so those programs continue. So in terms of the basic education programs that USAID ran, all of them were closed in all 55 countries except for Jordan.
And
Yeah.
Mackenzie, I was wondering about this and thinking about this. Why do you think Jordan is so important for the U.S. and the U.S. politics?
That is a really good question, Anastasia. I think when we think about USAID projects and which countries we work with, thinking about what are the broader implications of our work and kind of the geopolitical context of which programs go where and what funding continues. And so you can see that even when the agency has been officially dismantled, some of the work continues depending on what our priorities are. So that is an important thing to consider, that USAID is not always neutral, but it is still a form of public diplomacy. Well, moving on to John.
Power.
Yes, I agree. I also thought it was interesting, Johnny O's perspective regarding this whole incident, right? We're looking at about a year from the official closure and what Congress has been doing to continue funds, at least in some capacity.
It has certainly been one of the places where we've seen that in a significant way and not a good way. We've seen the near elimination of global education programs, and the elimination of those programs have created deep and lasting gaps in learning around the world. So for me, it's very personal. It's where my life story began. I was someone who was the first in my family to go to college. It wasn't an expectation for the people I grew up with, living in a steel town, a mill town. And so I know how much education made my life possible. And that's why I've been so passionate about these issues in Congress and on the Foreign Affairs Committee. We know that we had a vibrant portfolio of educational programs that was 165 different initiatives around the globe. We're now down to just two, exactly two programs. These are programs that reached more than 44 million learners every day, that expanded opportunity, that made U.S.'s support for girls' education known. It helped nations rebuild through knowledge and through skills. And again, these cuts are significant and the results are painfully clear. So Congress did reaffirm a bipartisan commitment to international basic education, where we had to fight very hard for a 25% top line cut to education programs in fiscal year 2026. And while it could have been much worse, it isn't necessarily a victory in my mind, right? So we have this money in place and we staved off a complete elimination of the funding, but we also don't have the programs to actually push that money into. So we're still waiting to see how the administration might direct and spend that money. And so for me, all of this is not right. It's not strategic.
What was interesting to me was that, not only we need to think about, what are the implications of cutting global education funding. We have a number of students, children, youth, or adults who've had experiences of disrupted learning. But also, how are our elected officials trying to navigate this terrain now? We see that there has been a new, or I guess a revised bipartisan commitment to international basic education, but obviously we're left with a gap of how that's going to be implemented into what capacity. Do you have any thoughts about this, Anastasia?
I mean, it's tough, right? There is not a lot of options, specifically in the current funding and with the current administration. I think we will talk about this a little bit later when we're going to discuss what's the future of international aid and U.S. aid on a global perspective by the end of this podcast. But what I found, another thing that I found interesting, that there are some certain views around the world that maybe dismantling of USAID is a good thing, right? And with that, I want us to transition to our next segment on critical perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, we have spent some very important moments looking at the critical perspectives, because we want to acknowledge the fact that there is some really strong criticism out there on USAID, especially in the post era. We're hearing those criticisms far more loudly. So thank you for introducing that, Anastasia. So, what are these critical perspectives that, arguably have been around for a long time?
So one of the things is for sure that needs to be discussed is that many scholars who were developing the critical perspectives were located in the Western countries and in the universities of Global North. And all this discourse is produced by scholars who are sitting in white institutions with these cultures of academia, and they are not very often grounded into the real experiences and on-site problems that development and international development is focused on. So I think that both Escobar and his critique and Zach's Zinn, Portes, and Rambaud, while their primary focus is the development research, they still represent graded programs in the wealthy countries.
Yes, and just to add to that, we kind of like in our class we discussed the history of development and how this idea of mass poverty was kind of created and recognized and kind of led to industries for this management of to manage this poverty.
Yes, and I think we can see how this discourse on theoretical discourse unfold in the community or in the grassroots by how in many aid recipient countries, what they called as developing countries or underdeveloped countries, how these aids are tried to educate or model what being modern means. I mean, in Pakistan, when you are educated, you are behaving as a middle class people. So this role modeling on how a modern developed people should be, that also unfolded in the grassroots. And I think that speaks how the discourse is shown and ingrained even in the level of society.
Yes, Flori, that really shows how like some of these ideas of development are hybridized and incorporated into local realities. And oftentimes it kind of forgoes the option to develop locally rooted systems.
Also, I would like to catch up on what Flori was saying and add to that the word development itself supposes that something has to be developed there, which already puts this site in a position that is seen like a problem. I think the language here is also important part of attitude and approach that we must critically address while talking about this topic. In this regard, Anna Roberts says,
for education, we specifically worked through education systems. We always worked with the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Youth. Our programs always worked to strengthen their systems. There were very, very few times where we didn't partner with the government. In pretty much every other country, we're going to partner with the government when we are designing the strategy for that country. Our goal with education was to strengthen the systems of that country and to design our programs in partnership with them. And so some of that was strengthening the capacity of the Ministry of Education.
Critics of U.S. international development argue that aid has historically served U.S. strategic interests more than recipient communities. And this is an important question, is how it's seen. Is it seen as attention advocating for programs like READ Act? And Journey O says,
look, I actually think that this isn't an either or question. I tend to look at it as a both and that the best programs advance both our strategic interests and support global stability at the same time.
Anna says,
our mandate from Congress with the READ Act had two things. The first was to increase learning outcomes for all children, and then to increase access for marginalized children. And marginalized children, that was in vulnerable groups. And that was a very large list because that can look very different in different contexts. But for the large part, that meant girls as well as children with disabilities. And so that's a pretty big mandate. And that would look different in different countries. So it gave us a lot of flexibility to design programs and to design what we wanted to achieve in different countries, as long as we kind of fit underneath that umbrella that children were learning and that we were increasing access for different vulnerable groups.
and George agrees here.
I think one is to acknowledge the fact that I do not think that there will be any mechanism or donor country that would support development that isn't aligned with their policies, philosophies.
Let's continue to hear from George.
And done with the local stakeholders, beginning with the government, communities, civil society, private sector. So all those were inputs into that. So I think that is the first thing that people need to acknowledge. Now, they were also funding sometimes would also come through congressional earmarks. And so when there's a congressional earmark, so it may, the earmark may not fully align with what would be a need locally. But that also is not an issue to my mind necessarily, because Congress also looks at the interests of the US, and also congressional, I think, teams also have their staffers. They also look at things. They also come locally to these countries. They talk to people. They may also have priorities that are informed by all these input. So I think that is something to acknowledge. So I think for that argument, I know I've had those arguments before. They are there. Does it sit neatly? No. Were there times when the governments would be uncomfortable with some USAID programs? Absolutely, yes. For two reasons. One, when we do our stakeholder engagements, it's not just government talk. We also talk to civil society. And civil society, my concerns are sometimes in conflict with what governments want. For example, if you're pushing our programs around accountability, they may cause discomfort within the government circles, but is that a bad thing? Not really. I think masses want accountability. So I think those are also things that we need to appreciate. And so that is that I can only share from my experience of what we used to do in presenting that. So it may not have been 100% meet with what the government wants, but I think it's an aggregation of what the government wants, what locals want, what civil society wants, what private sector wants, as well as what the US Americans want through their representatives.
I can add to that, independent on how many questions these programs raised, they still were focused on vulnerable groups and helping children. And there was a lot of thinking put into these programs before they were implemented. And so these designs did bring something to the communities that they benefited from.
Yes, and something that really stood out to me from our interview with Josh was that he talked about how most of these projects really helped some of the most vulnerable and marginalized people in a lot of these countries. So like LGBTQ people and also like disabled people who don't have a lot of facilities and rights. So USAID kind of helped set up systems that a lot of like these governments later adopted and are still in even after the dismantling of USAID. I think he talked about how in Jordan some of the systems are still in place and being run by the government.
Yeah, thank you, Anna and Shumaim. I think that highlights what Johnny O and Anna have argued on their statement that their intention and their interests are always inclined toward what the recipient government needs. So it is always focused on their strategic as well as the global strategic, and it is all come down to children's learning and their best development.
Now, one could argue then what value then do USAID fund bring? And that's where that's perhaps for me what matters most. What USAID funding was doing mostly was catalyzing. Because USAID allowed us to bring in, to work with experts, to have people think through certain programs within education, within health, in agriculture, and would catalyze, allow people to also come up with other ideas that may not be easy for government to come up with. And then governments would learn from this, and there are things that the government would pick up and scale. And I think that's important. So I'll give an example within the educational space. For example, we had a program, our early childhood programs that were able to help the government realize that it is possible to provide every child in primary school with a textbook. Something that looks difficult because of multiple factors, including just the cost of printing books. But that program showed that you could print books at a fraction of what was currently prevailing. And as a result of that, even though that program closed out, the government of Kenya still has that one child, one policy within the English Swahili. So I think that's probably the thing people need to appreciate, the fact that USAID did a lot of catalyzing and helping point governments in the right direction. And so could they have gotten there maybe on their own, maybe eventually over time, but it's in the idea of catalyzing, trying to help a process move faster. So that.
Yeah, so this is a great point made by George, that, and I kind of remember him saying this, that, it's an idea that we should probably try to remember the impact that USAID has made. It's difficult to kind of recapture some of that impact, but it's also very important to consider what that impact can look like in the future. And so this brings us to one of the final questions that we were asking our co-hosts, the former USAID workers and Congressman Johnny O. And that was, what does the future of international aid and development look like?
Seems to me currently to be much more politically driven. And we're moving, but also more locally driven. So this is an administration that is moving away from the old model of large Western agencies running big long-term projects towards a mix of smaller and hopefully more strategic investments that align with foreign policy and national security priorities. But I think what that means is more of a focus on crisis response, on stability, competition with big rivals like China. But it also means, and I think this is unfortunate, less funding for the traditional longer-term development programs that have suited the U.S. so well.
I think all of our co-hosts agreed that the future is going to be more locally driven, one way or another, and that maybe it's even a good thing, right? Because USAID wasn't perfect. There were issues, and we discussed these issues previously with critical perspectives. And so here is Anna's quote on this.
Do you think that, as some of your questions have alluded to, it has raised some good conversations about how could the process be improved? How could the system be improved? Can we bring in new funders, new partners? Can we change the way conversations happen? Can we change the way that ministries and partner countries are included in conversations? What can that look like? And I don't think that new system will happen in the next 3 years, but I do hope that it sets us up to be ready in a few years. If there are administration changes, or as development and humanitarian funding increases, which it will, because though there have been changes in the administration, Congress still has so many champions for this. We're still seeing funding coming from Congress. Funding is not going to stop.
Yeah, and Josh Josa also made a very, very important point. And we sort of remember this really clearly from him saying more local stuff, more retention of knowledge, and not just giving it all to contractors. So, really important point to make. Before I go on any further, let me just let Josh do the talking.
I hope that something like USAID comes back into existence. Yes. But I wish to see more centered around locally led development. So people would be able to contribute what problems they're seeing, what challenges they go through. USAID was already so advanced and they were kind of at the end of their course. It would have evolved to something like that eventually. But I do think it would be great to see more local staff, more retention of knowledge, and not just giving it all to contractors. There were a lot of contractors from the US or Western contexts. But recognizing that sometimes that balance between locally led staff and contractors is a good thing because the exchange of ideas and having those healthy discussions, all locally owned staff, then, what new ideas or approaches would they find from that process? If everyone is from that context, then they would just contribute what they know. And that really is the most apparent in terms of marginalized populations as well. I would love to see more country exchanges of some type, like people coming to the United States and developing countries, who are nailing it within their country, coming to help the US solve it here for us also. We have a massive car problem and we have no public transportation here, and some developed countries have figured that out easily. And some Latin American countries have license switches, buses. Why wouldn't we bring those people here and learn from them so they can educate us? Not everything is just us giving it back to them,
And Chris, with all of this in mind, from your personal perspective, what would you like to see the future of global aid look like?
Wow. Thanks for putting me on the spot there, Anastasia. So I tend to agree with the majority of our co-hosts who have said that aid needs to go back into the local hands. I also agree with Josh, who said that we need a more reciprocal process so that the recipient countries, there has to be some kind of, or maybe there should be some sort of exchange program, if you will, where recipient countries can go to the industrial countries, the industrial nations like the US, and learn by experiencing what they have, and then take those particular learnings or that knowledge back to their countries, in the same way that education and exchange works, right? So I do think local is important. That's always been my mantra, putting back that autonomy into local hands. And one might argue that some of these countries, these recipient countries, don't have the institutions that will help support properly the disbursing of aid, or even creating systems by which the aid will operate within the local space. And so maybe they don't have the capacity, but that's what I think the work should be going forward, is the building up of capacity, building up of institutions that will be able to support aid dissemination, creating systems that work within the local context, so that eventually these recipient countries can wean themselves of the need for aid, and that's a pie in the sky wish, because some of us on the critical side of things will say that the need for aid only exists because of the instability created by industrial nations. And so developing nations are in that particular space because of what developed nations have done. And so there's a part of this is, we have here in the United States a moral obligation to some of these countries that have these great needs. And we talk about education because we are in the international education space in this program here at the University of Maryland, College Park. However, the need is also, dealing with health, with hunger, with the inequity all around. And so we kind of need to think about how we can empower the local recipient countries and provide the aid where it is necessary, because aid is a must because of the world that we've created, but also it's our moral obligation to help those who have not. And so I think that's where it needs to look, what it needs to look like, more local, reciprocal processes, and definitely continuing to fulfill a moral obligation going forward. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more on this. Yep. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. And maybe one final thing is that, we've seen this in the United States quite a bit, where there geopolitics, and we talked about Jordan earlier on in this episode, but geopolitics plays such a huge role in the projects that the U.S. has historically tried to fund. I would like to argue that, while geopolitics is important to consider because there is need, for example, in Jordan, that those shouldn't be the driving factors going forward. And priorities have to be placed in places where the greatest needs exist, regardless of U.S. Interests in certain areas. And so that's what the future needs to look like. Will it be as grand as it has always been? Will the character of USAID look the same way? Maybe it shouldn't, but it definitely isn't something that's necessary. So that has brought us to.
Yeah, do you think that's achievable, though, to completely separate politics from aid?
I don't think so. I do think it, like everything else, it takes political will, and I'm not sure that the U.S. is willing to give up, the amount of power that it wields around, and that power has a lot to do with its influence. Maybe let me flip it. Let me flip it. So maybe the future is going to look very different, and it probably really is possible, right? There is a light at the end of the tunnel. There is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So perhaps it is possible, Anastasia.
All right, let's hope.
Let's hope. All right. So that's brought us to the end of our podcast. We had asked our wonderful co-hosts for their take on, the future. All right. Thank you all for joining us for our podcast episode on the post-USAID era of international aid and development. We are very excited for what will happen in the future. Let's keep talking about USAID for the future. Let's keep the aid conversations going, because aid and development walk hand in hand, and we have to make sure that we are all pushing to help each other on this planet.